the Within Orb podcast. Come get Within Orb. Hello, my name is Jenn Zahrt, and welcome to Within Orb, a production of the Celestial Arts Education Library, a podcast bringing people together around the love of astrology, books. Join me as I interview people about the astrology books that changed their life and practice. You can support the podcast at withinorb.com. Welcome to another episode of Within Orb, and today we are going to cross the country and head out to Orlando, Florida to meet Blaze-Maximus. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jen. I'm so honored to be here today. Thank you.
Yeah. So I met you most recently at NORWAC, but I've seen you around the Twitter sphere, aka RIP Twitter, X space. And yeah, it was pretty cool. I love the fact that you're into a kind of astrology that I'm personally really fascinated by in the research territory. So I can't wait to talk to you about that. But before we go there, I would love to ask you, what was your first astrology book?
So my first astrology book was called Love Signs by Laurie Reid. I'm holding up a half-heart book right now. It is velvet. It is pink. It has little indents of all the signs, and it says Love Signs. And this was the first book that I've had since I was 6 years old. So I have kept this with me since birth, because the thing is about like my first book in astrology is they come from my mom, because my mom was into astrology. Awesome. So she was reading Parker's Astrology. She was reading different, the big astrology books in the times of the 80s, 90s, and eventually when I came around. So I inherited kind of a lot of these books, but this was the first one I distinctly remember getting my hands on reading, and I have my stickers from when I was a kid still inside
awesome.
Here. So
I love how when you open it up, it becomes a heart. The book itself is shaped like a heart.
It becomes a heart. I don't completely agree with everything in this book now, but it fundamentally changed the course of everything that I did with astrology. Because I'm this little 6-year-old saying, yeah, I'm a Virgo, and yeah, I'm analytical.
That's awesome. You got it when you were 6. I have starting envy, because I got the astrology bug when I was 15. So I'm like, oh no, that's so cool. That's so cool. So what else did you read as a youth then? There must have been others.
The other early book that I got was Astrology, A Cosmic Science by Isabella Hickey. I found this in a Barnes & Noble. It's this white cover, and it has a really beautiful rainbow mandala in the middle. And there's a foreword by Stefan Arroyo. And this was my first book that I really worked out of. It was the singular book that I started, because I started studying astrology seriously 2015, 2016, actually picking up books, actually seeing my horoscope, making sense of that system. And this was the main one I did for 2016, 2017 that I had, because I was in high school at the time, didn't have a lot of money, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So my trips for engaging with text with astrology was after school, because I grew up in New York. So after school in the city, what to do next? Go to Barnes & Nobles and read the entire shelf.
I love it. Oh, yeah.
And then I got William Lilly as my first traditional text.
Okay. Who turned you onto that? How did that come in your hands? Was that on the shelf at Barnes & Noble?
I don't think it was on the shelf on Barnes & Noble, but I started finding Chris's work, the fact that he was doing Hellenistic Astrology, and the book just came out in 2017. So then we're on 2018, we're dealing with magical Renaissance kind of vibes. And then 2019's Jupiter-Saturn comes around, you know what I mean? I start finding the tradition of astrology. So I don't quite remember how it happened, but I definitely entered the online sphere and saw what people were talking about, what people were referencing. And I was like, okay, I'm going to get it. And then I had some conversations with Chris, and he sent me his book actually on Hellenistic Astrology.
Wow,
and
okay.
That was my first read. Basically, the tradition there was from him, because I was doing some work for him for the astrology dictionary. I wrote an entry about accidental dignity at the time. But now looking back on it, I'm I could have used more than just Lilly to talk about that. I could talk about that in an essay now, but that was my influence at the time.
Did your mom ever teach you anything? Or did she kind of keep clear lanes with that?
Oh my God, my mother is so interesting. She's a Jupiter Scorpio native. So, she has the mind for the occult and learning those things. Interesting thing, she actually casted my nativity at birth. So I was born the day after 9/11, which was a crazy event in history, but also literally crazy nativity, having that as well too. And so I was unpacking that, but my mom literally has a baby book where she cut out my chart, put it right in. And then I found out, as I'm studying later, my mom has actually her nativity done by an astrologer.
Wow.
And this is her chart right here. It's this kind of old paper, it was made in 1971, and it's a wheel that's drawn out. She has some of the aspects, some of like the oppositions in her chart, or the trines. She has all of them like labeled out. And they also come like with delineations too. But like there's also like this beautiful image of like a bird here.
And it's all handwritten.
It's all handwritten. It's really interesting because this is also like my lineage too. Like my mom literally got her chart done. And like it's interesting to see like her practice because she has all the like indications of the houses written out here. And we're like, okay, so like when we're thinking about 1970, what is the astrologer thinking then? Well, they know the first house is early life appearance. The second house is money and gains, you know, third journeys. And then you look back at these at some of the tradition, you're like, oh, wow, there's a lot of similarities between what she's doing here. And she's using like the outer planets. She's using different minor aspects as well too. And she's also giving like a legend and actually like a key for like what all these things mean.
Wow, what a fascinating thing to have in your family lineage there.
Yeah, I feel like it's an artifact, honestly, because, and I like treasure it so much because, like, even though I wasn't aware of it, like, this was sitting here in like the bloodline and like the ancestry, just a horoscope in like the archives. Very Saturn.
Yeah, and it's your own mom's horoscope as well. And oh, that is such a treasure. So thank you for sharing that. That's amazing.
Of course.
All right, here comes the question of the show. If you were going to go to a deserted island and you could only take 3 astrology books with you, what would they be?
My first one is, I'm going to start with the Great Introduction because this one is a Ben Dykes' translation of it. There's a few translations I read, though. I have the Dykes translation. I have the KG Yamamoto and Charles Burnett translation. You know, I look at them side by side. I look at what Alome translates from that as well, too, to see like the comparisons. But I feel like if there's anything foundational that has been like so influential in my practice, it has been every chapter and every sentence of this book. Like just the synthesis that Abu Mashar has of like the Hellenistic worldview, the Persian worldview, and then also his Indic influences. Like, I mean, it's really the great introduction where you have so much that is laid out. And I even find myself like going back today as I prep for clients, like looking back and like reviewing certain things. And it's so fundamental to like anything. I mean, obviously there's so much more that you could be having here, but like if I was on a desert island and I needed to explain astrology to someone, like I would have everything I need in this book.
I love that. Have you noticed anything between the translations where you are seeing something triangulated and you're like, that's your take on that technique or something? Because something's like maybe this way with the Charles Burnett and then this way with the Ben Dykes, etc.
That happens all the time. And it happens more in like the Book of Religions and Dynasties, which is also Abu Mashar. But that one's more for like world astrology, because I feel like if we're at sea, like we're going to need to talk about like weather. We're going to need to talk about like floods and like, you know, when should we sail the sea? Like, what is that looking like? What is the patterns looking like? When I go through those translations a lot, I will be picky about like which way I lean towards certain things, because there's certain words that like I will have to go to the Arabic translation and like really research that word and understand like, okay, well, this is Dyke's interpretation. This is Burnett's interpretation. Like, now let's see where I lean. And then I think about like, you know, the astrological knowledge I have coming in, because I don't know, I think there needs to be more like translators who are astrologers. That way we have an understanding of like certain terminology that maybe like certain academics might not have a understanding of in the same way. So I find myself definitely formulating like my own ideas about that. And it's actually very fun. It's like my Gemini brain loves it so much.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. Are there any specific examples that stand out to you where you sort of felt like you were discovering something? Just in Abu Mashar's Great Introduction, if that, just to narrow it down to that one book.
Well, you know, it's very much about word choice, specifically in like his planetary indications where he goes through like the list, like certain things that he'll list. I don't quite agree. Like if whether it's something related to Mars or something related to like Venus or like Mercury or like whatever the case might be. I don't have a specific example off the top of my head, but if I go through the like and I look through them side by side, I'm just very interested in everyone's word choice. And again, the word choice on how we get from translation to like English, because to me, I feel like so much context gets lost in translation, truly. And I think that's like one of my goals is eventually like to like actually like learn and study Arabic and like actually read these texts in like the original format to have like that astrological knowledge, but then also like, okay, like maybe like give my hand at a translation, because every translation is going to be different of something. So I'm still kind of working through that, still kind of in early phases of understanding that. But I don't have a specific example right now.
No worries, no worries. I still love how closely you're looking at the texts and that you're already triangulating in a way like, I've got this translation and this one, and I'm not going to just take this one translation's word for it, literal word, right? Like those were choices that were made.
Exactly. And then I see something Olomi posts and I'm like, oh, wow, that's really interesting. Because I've read, he covers a lot of this material. And then I'm like, oh, I've actually read this. And I'm like, wow, like really interesting. Like, for example, actually in Sahl's book that I was looking at in comparison to something Alomi translated, where he was talking about like Mars in a double-bodied sign. Like if Jupiter's in the night chart and it's the triplicity ruler, like Dykes has in his like footnote, like, oh, this should indicate the abundance of children because Mars is in a good dignity. But then Alomi is like, well, actually, this was the indicator of sterility for children. And I'm like, oh, this is where the translation error is coming from.
Yeah.
And so it's things like that. I noticed that like there's a lot of nuance that sometimes translators, miss, or sometimes like the word choice or even the text themselves are just like illegible. So I always try to read like everything with a discerning eye that, the English translation is not always what it seems as the actual like material.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Okay, so you mentioned another book, which I think is your second book. So let's just circle back to that. And so your second book on this deserted island would be?
Religions and Dynasties.
Okay, also by Abu Mashar.
Also by Abu Mashar. I mean, this one is all world astrology, which has been very like important for me lately. And just studying that because, I mean, I've studied a lot of horary astrology. I've studied natal. I've done a lot of predictive stuff. I do electional regularly. And like world astrology, she's that girl and she's the hardest one to kind of tackle because then you're like applying everything into like a different context, not in like a nativity, like, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like there's so much of that information that is generally that could be very helpful, whether it's looking at ingresses, looking at lunations, looking at conjunctions. I mean, I've really been in the conjunctions lately. Those are my favorite things right now. I think that book provides really good framework and also like straight up delineation. Like you want to see what Saturn in Aquarius means? Here you go. It's right there. You want to see what Mars in Gemini is going to indicate in world astrology? Well, it's right there. And then, it's kind of used as an early warning system so we can move with how the Earth is changing and unfolding. And then if we're trying to survive, we know what's coming. So we're going to be seeing it in advance.
Yeah, for sure. Do you think that gives you a leg up on being a more public astrologer and making predictions or sort of forecasting for the year ahead?
See, it's a little tricky because world astrology is, as Alomi and some of the students of Abu Mashar have said, is something that needs to be drawn out very judiciously, carefully, and cautiously, because the delineations that Abu Mashar gives are not like for the weak. Like there's going to be plagues, there's going to be lightning strikes. Yes, exactly. So like to me, I always try to situate that context of the text in like, okay, let's see what's actually going on. And like, let's see what's actually going on in the world. And like, I had an instance where I've been doing my predictions more like on a Patreon, like kind of basis, because I don't want them to be completely public, but I want people to engage with them because I don't want to create hysteria around them because it's really not about like hysteria, which is like sometimes what you see, a lot of content on the internet is, oh, wow, this eclipse means it's the end of the world and everything's going to happen. So, I think
those moments where they're like, it's rare, there's 6 planets retrograde. And it's like, no, there's just a stellium and the sun's in the other side of the zodiac.
Yeah, the planets are just all morning stars right now. Like, let's be real.
Oh my God.
So I really, like, in studying the tradition, it's helped me to really, because I want to bring astrology to people and help people, like, learn about it. And I think learning, like, the actual framework of world astrology has helped in my own way to discern like what I see, not only in the media and in the public, but also like other people's delineations that like, okay, let's see which ones I kind of agree with, which ones I don't, which ones are more likely to happen. And I mean, one of the big predictions that I got recently was the Libra eclipse that happened this past spring. The horoscope, at least for DC, was a Capricorn rising. And so the ruler was Saturn in the third. Mars was also in the third. And so I was like, well, calamities around water, calamities around ports, around ships. And it was literally right after I think it was actually probably a moon sign after the eclipse that there was this ship that crashed into this bridge in Baltimore.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, like, and this is tying stuff in the Aries ingress. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's not even about like, being public or anything, but it's actually seeing this framework and, seeing Alomi, who has actually been doing this for like 10 years as like a world astrologer. Because that's how they said that, the world astrologers would kind of operate. They have someone who's working either for like a king or a ruler. And then they go down to people who are kind of working off of their work. And that's how I kind of consider myself here, is that Alomi has more of this expertise in the field. And then I'm actually starting to learn how to do the practice and do the delineation. And so now I see like, oh, he says like there's these dangers because of Mars in Aquarius in the horoscope. Well, now we know to time this with the eclipse because the eclipse says this. So really weaving different like times and shifts in the world and actually seeing that unfold and like participating and making predictions in that. And like, it's kind of been a really wild thing to experience, but I've also realized how like you really need to make sure people want to see that type of thing, because you're not going to say like, yeah, rare alignment, all the planets are going to be here. These are world events. These are the shaping of our world and the things that happen. And I don't know, I think the framework that Abu Mashar gives in that book, which is the introductory book for that framework, while very dense and very at times I find myself racking my brain trying to parse it out. I think it's very fundamental for understanding how the world itself shifts, because then you have your foundations, you have the world, and then I would give Sahl as my third one for nativities.
Imagine stepping into a room of 5,000 astrology books, turning a corner and stepping into a room of 2,000 more. The Celestial Arts Education Library is every astrologer's dream, and it can be yours. I invite you to come support CAELi before you can visit physically. Your support will mean the creation of 52 new episodes of Within Orb next year, 4 issues of the CAELi Review, our inaugural journal, and countless book talks, events, classes for our community. Visit our website, www.caeli.institute/support, to select your level of care. Please help support CAELi into the future, our future, so that we may study the future together. Thank you for listening. Please enjoy the rest of the show. All right, so we're on your third book.
Exactly. So then we're bridging the nativities to the world, to the general foundations here.
You've got it all in this island.
Yeah.
We got to come visit you. This is going to be the place to go, actually. You're going to make it a destination. To stick with world astrology for a second, though, I wanted to ask about the feeling of seeing something that you see in the chart happen on Earth. I mean, how do you deal with that?
Well, if it's a good thing, I'm very happy because, like, for example, there's certain, like, I forgot which country it was recently. It was a country in Southeast Asia that, like, legalized same-sex marriage. And I was like, oh, this is Venus exalted in the horoscope of the year. This is the rise of advocates for people who are really trying to push back against, like, the Saturnian restrictive influence that comes to the Pisces individuals. So things like that, like, I mean, for me, it helps me be really grounded, especially living in a very, like, Republican, very fascist state. Like, be grounded on, like, what's actually happening and, like, see, like, hey, like, there's gonna, like, the Jupiter ingress immediately, like, with that new legislation I told you about earlier, where we had to lock all the doors in our school, immediately happened as Jupiter ingresses. And we're like, oh, Jupiter's the planet of law. It's impacting education because it's in Gemini.
Yeah.
So I think it's very much about understanding, like, the grounding in the present moment and where we're at. And that's kind of scary right now. Like, it's not the best time, especially with the court decisions recently with Jupiter and Gemini in the Supreme Court. But I think it really helps to identify, like, oh, where is this corruption actually taking place? For me, it helps me know who the enemy is. Ooh. And it helps me know where something is actually happening, because this is what you can then use astrology for. You know, there's going to be, like, you know, let's say there's going to be harm to, like, children or to, like, education or to, like, you know, book bans, for example. Well, we can be proactive now and be like, we see this coming. Now let's take action about what we can do. How are we going to archive our books? How are we going to archive our work? How are we going to make sure that people have access to resources so they can actually get this information and, you know, organize for libraries, things like that?
Ooh, you're setting up a really good moment for me to say, hey, you guys, if you want CAELi to be around after the apocalypse, I need your support.
No, if you want CAELi to be around after the Mars-Jupiter conjunction in Gemini,
there we go.
Yeah, like, you need to invest, like. And I think that's the biggest thing too, is because, like, you know, we could look at an eclipse and we could totally see something like that, like the destruction of books, the destruction of, you know, the burning of these things. Like, for people who care about, like, preserving knowledge, like, stuff like that could be very helpful, because that way, like, you know, we don't have, like, Alexandria burning, we don't have Baghdad burning, we don't have, like, these cultural centers of, like, knowledge just being, you know, thrown down the drain.
Yeah, no, we're going to fortify them. One thing that I saw in the Book of Religions and Dynasties that really impressed me was a way of measuring larger cycles of the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction and assigning them to a planet construct, such that the recent Saturn-Jupiter ingress, like the great mutation into air signs, happened to coincide with assigning that to, instead of Saturn in Virgo, it was Jupiter in Libra. And then there's a section of it, and this is related to some sensational propaganda published around the time of Martin Luther and the Reformation in Europe, where Martin Luther was given a fake birthday. Like, the propaganda was that his birthday was a year off so that he could coincide with the predicted Messiah after the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction.
Oh, wow.
Right? And so they were saying, oh, well, his natal chart looks like he's going to be the sort of predicted prophet of our time. But they relied upon a fake birthday in order to make that assertion and begin to unravel the trust in public astrology. And then I was thinking about this recent conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter at the 0 Aquarius point, sort of like finally initiating the air age, and how that relates to this Jupiter in Libra sort of label for the whole entire 360-year period, and what that might spell out for, like, the quote-unquote prophets of our time. Do you have any ideas about that?
Well, that's what I wrote about in my delineation, like about the dawr of Jupiter and Libra. One of the main things that Olomi has talked about with that is the breaking up of monopolies, and the breaking up of alliances, because that's a Jupiter, it's political parties, it's the alliances. But Libra is about the law, it's about justice, it's about those, matters. And I mean, I was listening in my post, well, Amazon's getting sued, Google's getting sued, Microsoft is getting sued, Ticketmaster's getting sued. Like, you have all of these trusts and like these companies, like these big monopolies who are kind of running the government right now. Like, that's kind of where we're at. And I think the Jupiter and Libra dawr, it's interesting because it is more optimistic. You have Jupiter, the greater benefic, who brings liberation, it brings freedom, it brings all of these virtuous qualities. And then you have Libra, fundamentally a sign of justice. The way I see that is that it's this contrast between a Saturn-Jupiter, very Saturn-Jupiter, restrictive, orthodox air kind of situation, where there's this tension between what the hegemony is trying to hold on to, what little power it has left, with what other forms of justice can kind of take place from Jupiter and Libra here. So it's this kind of tension between both of those, the new orthodoxy, the old world and the new world in a way.
Love that. Yeah. I wonder if Naomi Klein's having her moment now. I don't know if you've heard of a book called No Logo.
No, I haven't.
It was about the WTO protests and this idea that corporations through the World Trade Organization are more influential than democracies. And so in the coming times, we have to pay close attention to how those types of capital maneuvers are undermining our political systems.
Oh, no, totally. I mean, that's how they would interpret it as well, too, is literally like Jupiter is the alliances and the parties we make. And so, like, as we watch Jupiter, like, we're going to see alliances really reshaped, especially this summer, because that's a Mars-Jupiter conjunction right there. Like, we're seeing the alliances between people, the factions, the political parties, not just in the US, but abroad as well, too. Like, that reordering is definitely happening.
I love that you keep pointing to the Mars-Jupiter, because I feel like everyone has their eyeballs on the Mars-Uranus, and you're like, no, look a little bit further.
No, it's Mars-Jupiter. It's Mars-Jupiter. Well, no, because that's the lesser conjunction, and that's what Abu Mashar goes over in this book, is that, like, when you do your tiers, you have the 960 conjunction, you have the 240 conjunction, you have the 20-year, you have then the 2 years, you have Mars-Saturn, and then Mars-Jupiter. And for me, I think Mars-Jupiter and Gemini, because Gemini has these connotations specifically with international law. And whenever we see Mars and Jupiter conjoined, there's either conflict in the law, there's struggles, there's uprisings. Like, it's one of the big conjunctions of the superior planets here. And I think there's going to be some important change in like international law that we see, perhaps regarding Palestine and statehood and things of that nature. And the way that the alliances of the world are really shifting right now, right before our very eyes. And that's Saturn, Jupiter in effect. That's the dawr in effect. That's, the conjunctions in effect. And it's kind of crazy to watch. I mean, to really see what we're going through in the world, and honestly have astrology speak to that, which I think is very important too.
Yeah. I'm totally into this era of astrological technique. And so I feel like there could be a benefit to having a larger societal consciousness of the timing of the dawr, and that knowledge of how these periods play out beyond just the 200 years of the Saturn-Jupiter conjunctions, but also this like larger, the elements of them, but this larger concept of what the dawr is. So it's cool that we get to talk about it.
Exactly. I love it so much. It's so interesting, especially when you get to like the religious component of it, and how like the Venus Gemini dawr was the rise of Islam. You get things like Saturn and Cancer being the rise, or the actual Great Flood. Like, it's really interesting, like religious history and like world history that we can track with that. And that's eventually what I want to do in the future, is like actually go through history and like say, okay, these are these important years astrologically. Let's look at this part of the world. Let's look at that part of the world. What was going on? How is it reordered?
Future book assignment. Okay, so
future book assignment. Yes.
Let's get into your third book, which is Sahl's book on nativity. So you're bringing it down to the natal level, and you're pivoting to Sahl from Abu Mashar. Tell me more.
Sahl has such a great treatment on nativities. I mean, I've read Dorotheus' treatment. Valens has a treatment. I don't think I've actually read Abu Mashar's treatment. I don't think there's an English version of it, at least not something I have accessibly. I've read Masha Allah's treatment. I've read Al-Khayat's treatment. I've read I'm going to butcher it, Under Zakhar's treatment, I think.
That's who I want to meet. I want to meet that guy.
I want to meet him. I want to meet him because he's just who's quoted by everyone. And I'm like, okay.
I know. If I had to resurrect a dead astrologer, it would be Endar Zaghar instantly. Like, come on, buddy. Come on over.
Yes, exactly. But no, Sahl has such a great treatment of nativities. I mean, I review it a lot for clients just to refresh my brain of like significators. And I think the approach that Sahl and a lot of medieval astrologers take during the time is like, they take those topics of like life, assets or siblings or journeys or occupation, but they really like synthesize every significator together. Like, you got planets, you got lots, you got important points like the syzygy for work, for example. they give you streamlined indicators of what to look at. And I really love having significators aligned specifically with the topic you're trying to find, and there being a clear rationale that you can kind of backtrace through that and have it make sense to get to, where you're trying to go. Like, I was looking up for children, for example, like the indications of whether someone would have a lot of children, whether they would have few children, or whether they'd have no children. There's things you can look at with that, or you can look at how many partners you'll have, or like you can look at what the person's religion is, what their faith and their piety is, the master of their works and the things that they do in their occupation. Like, there's a lot of different of these kind of like astrological lists that they give, and I think one of the things you can really do is, like, once you take these lists, once you take these indicators, you know what to do, you sync them up to the timing techniques. Oh, and then you sync it up to the world astrology. So you see how what's happening in the world astrology can actually impact the nativity as well, too. So he gives a lot of good treatments on just identifying the situations and circumstances of a person's life through the astrological configurations, which I really appreciate.
So that gives us a little bit more of a high resolution picture that Ptolemy brings up in the abstract when he says, oh, well, first we have the chart of the nation, and then you have the chart of your town, and then it comes to your chart. So if something happens to happen to you that doesn't look like it's in your chart, it's because you're subjected to a higher chart, which seems a little bit like an excuse, but it sounds like Sahl's like, no, here's how you get there.
Yes, exactly. Like, you root everything that's happening in the nativity, and you start kind of there. And Ptolemy's very right. They're working in this Ptolemaic kind of worldview that even Ibn Ezra talks about this in his book as well, too, where like the influence of the larger world astrological predictions will supersede your nativity in a way. And even Al-Junawadi talks about this in the Garden of Stargazers, where world astrology is looked at as like a garden, and that your fate and your nativity is your boundary is in that garden, what you can do and what you can explore and what you can enact in your life, your free will.
Ooh, you just said my favorite word.
Ooh.
You just said boundary. Let's talk about
Boundary.
bounds for a second. Take it to the bounds just for fun.
Take it to the bounds. I love the bounds. Well, you know what I was reading? I was actually reading some indications about children, because again, I was reading through that chapter, and I just was noticing, like, wow, like they're talking about like planets exchanging bounds. And I just think that's so interesting that like there's these very specific and like niche delineations, whether it's about love or like children, like whatever the case might be. Like, you look at planets exchanging bounds, it means this. You look at a planet in this bound, it means this. And I think those delineations are like some of my favorite ones in the world.
Yeah, it's fantastic you're bringing that up in the context of looking at childbirth or having children, because my fascination with them really started when I heard Bernadette Brady talking about it in terms of Bonatti's take on kinship. And then I realized, every human being alive has come from the blood of another human being, whether they were related or not. If you were a surrogate, that's fine. Someone's blood brought you onto the planet. We don't get to escape that. As far as I know, there's no human being who's been born in whatever fashion on the planet who did not come with the aid of a different human being's blood. And so that concept of kinship and what that might mean for actually existing, like being manifest as an entity on the planet, just grabbed me. And then I was like, what else does this entail? Like, that's a real transmission, a true ancestral lineage factor that I think, then you look into like, well, what are the bounds? Why are they so confusing? Maybe they're so confusing because there is something extra to them that needs to be protected from simple understanding. And that makes me really curious to see what's going on.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
I love them. I think that the bounds, like, I mean, it's been really interesting to like see other people's take on like their rulerships and their assignments, and like, how do we get here? How do we get to the bounds we have? Yeah, I don't know. I think all the delineations that like Alomi has been translating, but also like are in some of these other books, like, that's really where the tea is. I mean, I always see that planet, like, it manifests its nature through the bound it's in. Like, one of the things that we use, like, for the custodians of the soul to identify a planet that governs the personality of the individual at that specific time is you look at the bound of your Lord of the Year, of your perfected Lord. So, like, if you know, like, for example, my Lord of the Year is Mars, my Mars is in the bound of Mercury, I know that the nature of my soul will be governed over mercurial things for the year, but the outer world is enacting some way through the inner world, which is the bounds here. And once I looked at it through that lens and, like, looked at people's Lords of the Year and, like, their bounds, like, it gets really gaggy at that point, like, with what you can do with delineation.
So just to clarify, it would be, okay, you found your perfected Lord from the Ascendant, and then you look at the natal bound that planet is in.
Yes.
Got it. Awesome. Oh my gosh. Wow. I have to pause now and just walk away and go calculate a bunch of things.
Calculate all your custodians for the past like 20 years.
I need a big spreadsheet. Okay, cool. So Sahl's book on nativities is the sort of natal lily pad that we're going to be on for here. Anything else you want to add about Sahl that you just found to be worth taking with you? Oh,
I'm biased, but one of his testimonies for career is like looking at the prenatal syzygy. I mean, it just like gives such life to a point that's described in so many different ways, but like actually having a specific application and use for it, like looking at occupation, looking at what someone does. And I think it's if the syzygy is aspecting either Mercury or like Jupiter, and it's like ruled by it or something like that. Like the person actually pursues a profession in the science of the judgment of the stars.
Oh
And
no!
and I'm biased because I have it, because my prenatal syzygy
I do too,
is,
actually. I'm like, what?
yeah, I'm like, oh wow, that's one of my indicators as an astrologer. But it's a full moon in Pisces, exactly trine Jupiter in Cancer. Like the lunation was exactly trine it. I was like, oh well, here we are.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
So no, I think the career stuff and like applications like that are just so incredible.
I love it. Yeah. And also the introduction to Ben Dykes' translation of Sahl is very good. I feel like that in itself should be a monograph, to be honest. So
No, yes. I mean, I disagree with a lot of Dykes's like comments sometimes in the footnotes and stuff, but like I look at all the books I have and I'm like, no one is translating this much volume of work in this way. Like this is an incredible amount of like wealth of like information. Like, I mean, I have in my bookshelf right now, I have it just says Dykes, because like, I mean, who's really translating like all of these stuff like this? I mean, It's incredible.
Well, and it takes an entire community because someone has to begin. And as we learn more and as more people engage with it, we will eventually retranslate or hopefully become bilingual or trilingual. But, you know,
That's the goal, the Gemini goal.
Yeah, exactly. A Herculean effort. Anyway. All right. So if you were going to be showing someone how to get into astrology, which books would you turn them on to so that they could get started?
My favorite book is First on the Heavenly Spheres by Helena Avelar and Luis Ribeiro. I wouldn't say I used it as an intro book, but I bought it because it is a foundational book in my opinion. I don't think of it as just an intro book, but like these are like your basic principles here. Like starting from temperament, starting from the Chaldean order, like starting from the worldview of like astrology itself, and then building each piece by piece. I just love the steps and the process that they actually do. And like they start with elemental theory, and they start with the worldview, and they start like with some of the astronomy of like the planets and how that actually gets astrological symbolism. I think they really walk you through a good comprehensive like list of basic like stuff, because you can expand on a lot of these themes and topics more, read other authors' take, but they have a really good comprehensive like, if you want to know this indicator, this is what it is, and this is some of the reason why, and they even pull some quotes too. But there's also really good visual in that book. I always want visuals with my stuff. I need to see it. I can't just talk about it. I need to like demonstrate it. I need to engage with astrology and see it and show it. And they do a really good job at providing those like visual references. That way someone can, you know, not only just see like, oh, this is like what the equator is, but like, or like the celestial equator, but like here it actually is shown relative to the earth. You know what I mean? Like things like that.
Yeah, that's a wonderful foundational text. Anything else?
Hellenistic Astrology by Chris Brennan is one of my foundational books. The Babylonian impact on like Hellenistic astrology in like Egypt, and also the Egyptian practice of like decans on astrology, like you get a lot of that foundation of like what we would even go for the medieval Islamicate tradition of astrology. Like a lot of that foundation we'll see in Chris's book, whether it be things like aspects, whether it be things like the signs themselves, their indications, the planets and their indications. It gives you such good like historical context too, because like he doesn't ignore the history. And I think that like understanding like what the practice was at that time, because if you want to understand even like stuff from the Renaissance, you want to understand stuff from medieval Europe, you want to understand anything, like you're going to have to work within that framework of Hellenistic Egyptian astrology, really. And I think he does such a great job at like presenting it and giving people not only just because it is kind of a very lengthy introduction, but like if you read through that whole book, like you will have a better foundation than a lot of like content that you'll see on the internet. You'll have a very solid understanding of important people in the Hellenistic period, how long that period was, and how there's different traditions and different intersections with different parts of the world. And you start to really get an understanding of the conversation, which I think astrology is very much a conversation between different societies, different groups of people. And it's a great introduction to start getting into what other people are talking about and seeing. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. So 2 blue books to kick it off. And where can people find you?
People can find me at astrobymax.com. That's my website. I offer consultations on there. I do natal consultations. I do forecasting. I do elections, and I do horary. And I'm also on Patreon too. And I'm doing like writings on like world astrology, some other stuff as well too. I'm actually starting to like try to flesh out some of my ideas and thoughts, not on just doing delineations, but like eventual like drafting of books that I want to write and like parts or essays or things like that. So just really trying to give more information like I have in my brain, more form there. And I'm on social media all the time. I'm on Twitter, usually hosting like spaces, which are like live discussions that people just come in, they listen. Sometimes it's chill. Sometimes we're like getting into really heated like debate about like planetary signification. But I'm always trying to like be in dialogue, whether it's on the internet, whether it's in person. And yeah, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok.
All right. All of it's going to be in the show notes. Well, thank you so much for spending time with me and
Yes.
getting a chance to talk about the dawr, because I love those. So
no, I love them so much. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And yeah, have a great day.
Yes. Have a great day too.
Thank you for listening to Within Orb. To learn more about the Celestial Arts Education Library or to become a member, visit our website at CAELi.institute. That's www.caeli.institute. If you enjoyed this episode, please help spread the word. Follow or subscribe to Within Orb in your podcatcher of choice, rate it 5 stars, or write us a happy review. This helps others find the show. We also want to give a big thanks to the indie band The E-Block for contributing their song Wake Up for our intro and outro music. You can find them at their website, eblockband.com. This is Jenn Zahrt, signing off for now. See you next time.